Okay, let's dig into this. The South African rand. It's supposed to be our currency, right?
The idea, yeah.
But sometimes, honestly, it feels like it's operating in a totally different universe from, our actual lives. Why does its value seem so detached?
That's exactly the puzzle we're looking at today. It's a really fundamental question. Who or what actually influences this thing that affects us all?
It really is. And for this deep dive, we're drawing on material from a specific source. It's a podcast called The Truth About the Rand, Who Controls Our Currency.
And it offers a, let's say, very direct perspective on this, quite provocative.
Definitely provocative. So our mission here is basically to unpack the arguments presented in that source. What do they say are the real forces moving the rand?
Right. What are the key factors according to their analysis?
Let's get straight into it. According to this source, what is the rand fundamentally? How do they frame it?
Well, they start with the name itself, rand. Comes from the Witwatersrand, rand, the gold reef.
Yeah, the gold connection.
Yeah.
Obvious link to South Africa's wealth.
Exactly. The source suggests that name was meant to tie it to the nation, maybe imply national control over its value.
Makes sense.
Yeah.
Symbolism. But the source then immediately argues that, well, despite the name, the rand isn't really controlled by the South African government or the people. That's quite a statement to start with.
It is a strong claim, and their reasoning centers on the fact that the rand is a free-floating currency.
Okay, so how do they explain what that means in this context?
They basically say, unlike a currency where the government fixes the value, the rand's worth is decided by supply and demand. But, crucially, supply and demand where?
In the global foreign exchange markets.
Precisely. So the argument is it's these huge international markets, traders, banks, hedge funds that are the primary drivers of the rand's value, not necessarily just what's happening, locally in South Africa's economy.
Okay, so its value fluctuates based on global trading. That's pretty standard for many currencies, though.
It is. But the source then brings up the South African Reserve Bank. They acknowledge it exists, obviously.
But there's always a but with this source, isn't there?
Well, yeah. They highlight its supposed independence, and they even mention it has private shareholders.
Ah, okay. So what's the implication there, according to the source?
They seem to suggest that this independence might actually mean it's more aligned with or maybe influenced by those global financial interests rather than purely national ones. It raises the question of accountability.
Whose interests come first? That seems to be the underlying question they're posing.
Exactly. And they make this point. Sure, the South African Mint prints the physical banknotes.
The actual rands in our wallet.
Right. But their value, the number they represent in the global system, that's determined elsewhere by these big international players.
So a disconnect between the physical currency here and its valuation out there. That's the core idea.
That seems to be the initial argument, yes. Geographically ours, but valued globally, potentially by interests not directly aligned with the average South African.
Okay. Then the source moves on to politics, right? How political statements allegedly affect the rand. They use a specific example.
Yeah, from May 2024, involving the Democratic Alliance, the DA.
What happened there, according to the podcast?
They claim there was a moment where the DA signaled it wasn't keen on a coalition involving the ANC and the EFF.
Okay, and the rand.
According to the source, the rand dropped significantly, like 4% in one day, just based on that statement.
Wow. And how did the source interpret the media reaction to that drop? Usually it's framed as market uncertainty, right?
Exactly. But the source pushes back on that. They argue, well, whose uncertainty are we talking about? They say everyday South Africans live with uncertainty all the time.
So they're saying this reported uncertainty isn't about us.
Their interpretation is that it reflects the anxiety of foreign capital, of international investors. They suggest maybe those investors were worried about potential policy shifts.
Interesting. So a different read on who gets spooked by political talk.
Yeah. And then apparently when the DA seemed to reassure the market later, maybe suggesting a continuation of certain economic policies, the rand strengthened again.
Okay. But they contrast this with how the market supposedly reacts to proposals from, say, the EFF.
Right. The source claims that when ideas like significant land reform or maybe wealth redistribution are floated by the EFF,
the market reacts negatively. The rand weakens.
That's the argument. And they don't just call it a market reaction. They frame it quite strongly as a form of economic censorship.
Economic censorship. What do they mean by that?
They suggest the market effectively penalizes political ideas that challenge the existing financial structures or upset international investors. as if the market itself is trying to block certain policies.
So the market isn't neutral, in their view. It actively shapes what's politically possible.
That's the interpretation presented, which leads directly into their next and probably most explosive claim,
Cookies.
that the rand has actually been rigged, deliberately manipulated.
Rigged. That's a huge accusation. What's the basis for that, according to the source?
They point directly to the findings of the South African Competition Commission back in 2017.
Ah, okay. I remember something about that. What did the commission find?
According to the source, the commission found evidence of collusion among 17 major banks.
17.
Yeah, 17. And not just local banks, big international names too. They list them. Barclays, Standard Chartered from the UK, Citibank, JP Morgan Chase, Bank of America from the US, BNP Paribas, Credit Suisse, Deutsche Bank.
Wow, okay. Global players. Any South African banks mentioned?
Oh, yes. Investec, Standard Bank, ABSA are listed too, plus others like Macquarie, ANZ, Nomura, RBC, Commerzbank. It's a long list.
So a mix of major international and local institutions. What were they allegedly doing?
The source claims they were coordinating, using secret online chat rooms. Apparently some had names like Czar Domination and the Cartel.
Seriously, czar domination. That's not subtle.
Not at all. And the alleged methods included things like fixing prices for rand dollar trades, sharing confidential customer information to benefit their own trades.
Basically working together to control the price.
Yes, and also allegedly creating artificial volatility, so causing sudden drops or spikes in the rand's value that they could then profit from.
And did the source put a number on the profits made from this alleged rigging?
They state a figure that's, well, it's staggering. Over 1.5 trillion rand.
1.5 trillion. That number is almost impossible to grasp.
It's enormous. And if true, you have to think about the impact that kind of activity would have had on the entire economy, on imports, on inflation.
Absolutely. And what about consequences for the banks involved, according to the source?
Well, this is where they get quite critical. They point to Citibank eventually paying a fine of around 69 million rand.
69 million.
Yeah.
Compared to alleged profits of 1.5 trillion.
Exactly. The source basically dismisses that fine as completely insignificant, a slap on the wrist, they call it, implying there wasn't real accountability for the scale of the alleged manipulation.
Right. That does seem like a huge disconnect. Okay, so moving on from the rigging allegations, the source then asks, who actually benefits when the rand is weak?
This brings it back to the practical effects, doesn't it?
It does. Who gains?
Well, the obvious group is exporters. If the rand is weak, South African goods become cheaper for people buying them with dollars or euros or pounds.
Unit economics, yeah.
Right.
Makes exports more competitive.
Right. But then the source makes a more critical point about domestic companies, particularly large retailers.
What do they say about retailers?
They argue that these companies often use rand volatility, just the general ups and downs, as a kind of cover or excuse to increase prices.
Even on things that aren't imported.
That's the claim. Even on locally produced goods where import costs aren't really a factor, the source suggests it's a way to boost profit margins, blaming the currency when maybe it's not the whole story.
Using volatility as a pretext. Interesting point. What about the banks themselves?
The source highlights the huge profits South African banks reported in 2023, something over 60 billion rand.
Okay, a profitable sector.
And the source asserts that a significant chunk of that profit comes directly from currency speculation, trading the rand.
So, tying back to the earlier point, the financial sector itself potentially profits from the very instability that might harm others.
That's the strong implication they make, that instability can be profitable for some key players.
Okay, let's talk about this phrase we hear all the time. Increased investor confidence. It always sounds like a good thing. How does the source interpret it?
Yeah, it's presented as the goal, right? Get investor confidence up. But the source offers a much more cynical take.
Oh, so.
They only that often when you hear calls for increased investor confidence. It's actually code for maintaining the status quo, specifically maintaining the current economic inequalities.
Meaning, no big changes that might redistribute wealth or power.
Essentially, yes. The source suggests that investor confidence goes down when there's serious talk about things like, well, the land reform we mentioned, or maybe a wealth tax, or increasing worker ownership.
Because those things might reduce profits for current owners or investors.
That's the connection they draw. And when those ideas are debated, you suddenly hear narratives about market instability or scaring away investment.
So the source sees investor confidence as a barrier to policies aimed at greater equality.
Pretty much. They argue the real fear among, perhaps, international financial interests isn't necessarily economic collapse, but a government that might prioritize the needs of its own population over, say, maximizing returns for foreign investors.
A fundamental conflict of interest, in
So-
their view.
Exactly, which leads them to this really powerful framing. They argue South Africa is still, in effect, economically colonized.
Economically colonized, even after political independence.
That's the argument. They draw a parallel. Historically, it was, direct political control, maybe symbolized by the British Crown. But now they argue the influence comes from different sources. Massive international banks like the Barclays and JP Morgan's mentioned earlier, or institutions like the IMF. The actors change, but the external influence, the economic dependency, remains.
So a shift from political to financial power exerting control.
That's the picture they paint. And they use South Africa's extreme wealth inequality to back this up. They cite the statistic, the top 1% controlling over 70% of the wealth.
A truly stark figure.
And they see this inequality not just as an outcome, but as part of the system they're describing. This economic structure benefits a tiny elite, heavily connected to global finance.
And how does the rand fit into this final picture?
The source claims that the wealthy elite, both local and international, use the threat of capital flight pulling money out of the country and the resulting rand instability as a weapon.
A weapon? How?
To fight back against any demands for greater economic justice or redistribution, they label this tactic economic terrorism.
Yeah.
Very strong language.
Extremely strong. Using the currency's instability to maintain an unequal system.
That's the core of their concluding argument.
So, wrapping this up, the central message from this source, the truth about the rand, is basically, our livelihoods, yours and mine, are tied to a currency that we, and even our government, don't really control. Is that fair?
That's a fair summary of their position, yes. They paint a picture where global markets, alleged manipulation by banks, and the interests of international capital hold enormous sway over the rand.
And they don't shy away from harsh labels. They call this system unjust, designed to benefit a few, and ultimately describe it as economic apartheid.
Yeah, that term really lands with impact. It deliberately connects present economic structures to the inequalities of the past, suggesting a continuation in a different form.
And their final word, the ultimate takeaway.
It's quite direct. True ownership of South Africa, they say, isn't possible without true ownership and control of the rand. The currency is key.
A call for monetary sovereignty.
Let me put it that way, yeah. For the currency to serve the nation, not just global markets or a small elite.
It certainly leaves you with a lot to think about. As you listen to this, just consider those connections the source draws between global finance, political statements, alleged backroom deals, and the value of the money in your pocket.
And maybe question those standard narratives we hear about investor confidence or market stability. Who defines those terms and who really stands to gain or lose based on how our currency behaves?
Exactly. It prompts you to think critically about who benefits from the way things are currently set up. A provocative perspective indeed.